In this post-apocalyptic wasteland, a woman named Anne lives alone on a farm with only her dog for company. She regularly travels to a nearby ruined town for supplies, wearing full body protection against radiation and carrying an oxygen tank to breathe safely. Anne's farm sits in a valley far from town, making every supply trip a long journey, but she considers the effort worthwhile to stay protected. Strangely, the valley itself appears to be completely free of contamination. After each supply run, Anne always scrubs herself down thoroughly to wash off any traces of radiation. Her dog shares her bed each night, offering the only companionship she has against the crushing loneliness. Life on the farm is uneventful, and Anne spends most of her days bored. Her days follow a steady routine of tending to the animals, inspecting the fences, and checking the traps she has set in the forest. Her dog assists with the hunt by tracking rabbits using its keen sense of smell. Then one day, Anne is startled to come across an abandoned vehicle sitting on the road. As she moves in for a closer look, her dog suddenly alerts her to a presence nearby. They duck into the tall grass and watch as a man dressed in a hazmat suit retrieves his wagon and moves on. Stunned to see another living person, Anne secretly tails him down the road. The man pulls out a scanner and uses it to verify that the area is free of radiation. Satisfied by the reading, he removes his helmet and breathes in the open air. Anne watches as the man, John, lets out a jubilant cry and strips off the rest of his suit. When Anne steps out of hiding, she finds John washing himself beneath a waterfall. She races toward him to warn him off, but because she is holding her rifle, John mistakes her for a threat and raises his own weapon at her. He fires into the air, demanding to know who else is out there, and Anne raises her hands and urgently warns him the water is poisoned. A panicked John sprints back to his wagon and uses his scanner to confirm he has been soaking in radioactive water. As he begins to vomit, John desperately begs Anne to inject him with the medicine she is pulling from a syringe. His panicked cries make her hesitate, so he tosses his weapon away and swears he won't harm her. Anne gives him the injection and offers to bring him back to her home. John explains he will need a daily injection and asks her to burn his contaminated clothing. He wraps himself up and follows her, also making the grim request that she burn his body if he doesn't survive. Back at the farm, Anne carefully scrubs John down with clean, uncontaminated water. He is so weak that she has to physically drag him into bed. The following morning, Anne heads back to John's wagon to collect his belongings, including photographs of him with an unknown woman. Over the next several days, Anne tends to John without rest, monitoring his temperature, keeping him fed, and administering his daily shots. At night she lies awake, listening to his bed rattle from the fever chills, spending hours pressing cool, damp cloths against his body to ease the trembling. After dozing off beside him by accident, Anne wakes and quietly prays for his recovery. She also visits the chapel to play the organ as a form of prayer and devotion. John eventually pulls through and is able to get out of bed, though Anne still has to support him as he walks. She tells him that her father had instructed the family to stay put on the farm because the valley would keep them safe. One day her family left to search for other survivors and never came back. John is baffled by why the valley remains uncontaminated and grows irritated at the lack of any logical explanation, but Anne pulls him into a hug to change the subject. The next morning, John sees Anne tending the crops by hand and retreats inside to the house library, reading up on farming techniques. He goes to join Anne outside, but he is still too frail to offer any real assistance. Anne explains that the tractor has run out of fuel and the pumps have no power to draw more. John walks her through operating the pumps by hand, and Anne rushes out to the field, thrilled to finally have fuel again. From the house, John peers through his rifle scope to watch her from a distance. Soon Anne is happily driving the tractor through the fields, with the dog bounding after it in delight. That evening at dinner, John pauses to bow his head in prayer before eating. He then reveals that he survived the catastrophe because he was working inside a government research bunker when it struck. He eventually walked away from the bunker because he felt confined underground and craved a real life on the outside. Anne asks if he was searching for the woman in the pictures, but John clarifies she was not his wife. When bedtime arrives, Anne heads to the barn and quietly reads a book. She deliberately leaves her bedroom door open. John notices her bare legs through the doorway but quietly retreats to his own room. The following day, Anne goes fishing at the pond and takes the chance to swim, exchanging long glances with John as he watches from the bank. Afterward, as they cook the fish together, Anne explains that the pond draws from the same underground water pocket as the well. The pond will freeze come winter, she tells him, and recalls how brutal the last winter was when her generator broke down. After heading back, John examines the generator and determines the engine is completely burned out. Anne blames herself for overloading it with the DVD player, but John assures her the aging generator would have failed regardless. Anne cracks a joke about potato-powered school projects, and it suddenly sparks an idea in John. They walk to the waterfall and, after sizing it up, John concludes he can construct a water wheel capable of powering the generator. To get the wood he needs, John proposes tearing down the chapel. Anne firmly objects, explaining that her father built the chapel so he could lead Sunday services for the family. She is convinced that the chapel is the very reason the valley remains untouched by contamination. John suggests her father or God may have intended the chapel as a resource for rebuilding, but Anne holds firm in her refusal. Anne insists once more that the water is clean, then repeats herself as if trying to convince not just John but herself. That night the dog won't stop barking at the door, though no clear reason can be found. The following morning, Anne tends to her usual chores while John performs maintenance on the farm equipment. Afterward, John heads to a roadside market to stock up on supplies. When Anne arrives to join him, she finds him heavily intoxicated. John stumbles around, knocking boxes over, claiming he has figured out her preferences by studying what she had used up and what she had left behind. That night, as Anne tries to help him to bed, John shoves her against the wall and snaps that he doesn't need anyone looking after him. Shaken with fear, Anne flees to her own room. The next day, John heads to collect eggs at the farm, finds the nest empty, and apologizes to Anne for his behavior the night before. Sometime later, while Anne plays the organ at the chapel, she notices a figure watching her from a distance, but the person has vanished by the time she steps outside. Thinking it was John, Anne heads to the farm to let him know he is welcome to listen any time, but John insists he never went anywhere near the chapel. That evening the two share a warm dinner over good wine and end up dancing together. They share a kiss, but John pulls away before things go further, thanks her for dinner, and retreats to his room. A few minutes later John steps into Anne's room and she quickly jumps up to get dressed, but he motions for her to stay as she is. A confused Anne asks what she did wrong, and John reassures her he is attracted to her, but says moving too fast would change everything between them. The next morning Anne reverses her decision and tells John he can take the chapel, but he turns her down, not wanting to cause her more pain. Later, while Anne is out checking her traps, the dog abruptly bolts up the hill, barking furiously. Anne follows and finds a man named Caleb, who immediately swears he means no harm and only needs some water. Anne brings Caleb back to the farm and has to physically step in to stop John from shooting him. John scans Caleb for radiation with his device, while Caleb confesses he was the one who had stolen the eggs. He explains he was too frightened to ask directly because survivors are not always welcoming to strangers. Caleb survived because he worked in a mine and happened to be underground when the disaster struck. His fellow miners set out to find their families and never returned. He says he plans to continue heading south and asks if he can spend just one night, promising to leave by morning. The scanner picks up trace radiation on Caleb, and he admits he has been feeling weak and has already vomited a couple of times. John agrees to let Caleb rest at the farm for a few days until he is recovered. Caleb begins pitching a tent outside, but Anne persuades John to let him come inside for lunch. Caleb prays alongside Anne at the table and laughs with amazed relief that he has made it this far alive. They exchange stories of their journeys, and John shares his own, mentioning a sick teenager who had raided his wagon for food. The boy was so ravaged by radiation sickness that he had begged John to put him out of his misery. John refused to kill him and instead left him by the roadside to die on his own. In response, Caleb reveals that his coworkers did not actually abandon him at all. One miner tried to leave, but the others blocked the exit, terrified that opening the door would let radiation flood in, driven past his breaking point. That miner snapped and killed most of the crew before anyone could stop him. Anne expresses her sympathy for Caleb's ordeal, and John quietly stings at the fact that she never offered him the same compassion. After Anne gives Caleb a tour of the house, John pulls her aside and scolds her for being too open with someone she barely knows. Anne fires back, telling him how devastating it was to cope with her family's disappearance and to survive entirely on her own. John admits he actually did kill the boy and wonders aloud if he might have been Anne's brother, breaking down into an apology. Anne weeps but gently tells him it is all right. Sometime later, John and Caleb head into the woods to hunt together. They discuss intercepted radio signals that mentioned a surviving settlement somewhere to the south. Finding that community is Caleb's driving mission, but John is deeply skeptical anything is left to find. As far as John is concerned, there is simply nobody left out there. At that moment, a turkey crosses their path and Caleb jokes that whoever brings it down first wins. John doesn't find it amusing at all, but Caleb laughs it off and swears it was only a joke. As they chase the turkey, John tells Caleb all about his water wheel plan and why he can't go through with it. In the end, it is John who fires the winning shot and brings the turkey down. That night over turkey dinner, Caleb raises the subject of the water wheel, and the mood turns uncomfortable for everyone at the table. Caleb tries to brainstorm other lumber sources, but without proper tools for cutting trees and no wooden structures nearby that aren't contaminated, options are slim. Caleb argues the chapel is the only viable source of wood, leaving Anne with no real choice but to reluctantly agree. The following day, all three work side by side to take the chapel apart board by board. As they work, Caleb and Anne keep catching each other's eyes. Over the following days, as John directs the wheel's construction, he grows increasingly irritated watching the glances between Caleb and Anne blossom into open flirting. The group also drives along the road, stripping cables down from the utility poles. Later, Anne sits quietly among the ruins of the chapel, and Caleb tries to comfort her by suggesting they take a walk together. On their walk, he opens up about his father, who dreamed of becoming a preacher but wound up in prison. Caleb admits he drifted away from church for years, yet his faith quietly stayed with him throughout. He believes faith is what shields the valley, and that he and Anne have been chosen to rebuild what was lost. Anne is moved to finally have someone who truly understands her, given that John does not share her faith. When the two return to the farm, John watches them arrive with barely concealed jealousy. That night, John tells Anne she should pursue something with Caleb, insisting she deserves to explore her feelings rather than wait around for him. Anne breaks down crying, unable to understand why John is suddenly pushing her away. John keeps telling her everything is fine, framing his decision as the right thing to do for both of them. John presses on with the water wheel while Anne quietly struggles with her feelings for him. To install the first section of the wheel, Caleb suits up and wades into the radioactive water, letting them make significant progress. That night, the three mark their progress with wine, music, and a round of cards. They end up leaping into the pond and playing a game to find a submerged bottle. But John feels like an outsider, as Caleb and Anne keep pairing up and sharing knowing glances. On the walk home, John finally breaks down and tells Anne he loves her, but she stays completely silent. Back at the house, Anne climbs into bed beside John, but he is so drunk that he instantly passes out. Fed up with John's drinking and his emotional distance, Anne slips away to Caleb and the two become intimate. The next morning, Caleb casually strokes Anne's hair at the breakfast table in front of John, and she is so unsettled that she gets up and leaves the room. The men agree to keep working without her and end up talking about how remarkable she is. Caleb asks whether John wishes he had never shown up, but John denies it and credits Caleb with making the wheel project possible. Caleb laughs and says he doesn't buy it, telling John he can see the jealousy written plainly on his face. He even floats the idea of staying on the farm permanently rather than continuing south to search for the settlement. That afternoon, Caleb suits up once more and joins John in the water to complete the final stage of the project. They slot the last pieces into place and the water wheel begins spinning perfectly. After a brief celebration, Caleb starts climbing back up and loses his footing on the slick rocks. John grips the rope tightly with both hands, stopping Caleb from plunging below. Caleb regains his footing and nearly reaches the top, only to slip again. John catches the rope at the very last second, but goes completely still, not pulling. The two men lock eyes, and a terrible unspoken choice hangs in the air between them. Later, John makes his way back to the farm, and Anne begins to apologize for what happened the previous night. He tells her he is sorry too, but admits he does not know what to do next. John cuts her off to tell her that Caleb has left and gone south to search for the settlement. Anne refuses to believe it and runs out searching for him. But no matter how far she goes, there is no trace of Caleb anywhere. John finishes connecting all the wiring and the farm finally flickers to life with electricity. When Anne returns home, she discovers that John has moved the organ into the barn for her. She takes a seat and begins to play, and John simply listens, finally at peace.